Liberals likes to do this, that the political compass, fascism and communism are the two sides of political spectrum, horseshoe theory and this one and this and so on, that they compare Stalin to Hitler. You're saying that, oh, they are all the same, they are all dictators. You are stupid. You guys are stupid. Dear comrades, friends, and fellow workers, today, 21st of December 1878, marks the birthday of Comrade Stalin. It's been 147 years ago since he was born, yet he is one of the most controversial figures in the history of international communist movements. Today, from a Marxist-Leninist perspectives and standpoints, we will talk about the line that is always said by Marxist-Leninists, that Stalin did nothing wrong. So let us be clear from the very beginning. When we, Marxist-Leninists, say that Stalin did nothing wrong, we don't mean that Stalin literally did nothing wrong. We mean that judged in his historical context, in the conditions he faced, and in the light of the goals of socialist construction, and finally in the defense of the first worker state, Stalin's fundamental line, the industrialization, collectivization, defense against fascism, and building socialism in the USSR was broadly correct, necessary, and historically justified, despite its real errors, excesses, and even crimes that occurred along the way. We are not children. We all know that no leader is infallible. But we also refused these demonized cartoons that the bourgeois propaganda has constructed. Our task is not a worship, but a materialist assessment. So why do we always say that Stalin did nothing wrong? Here are the points. First, he turned a backward country into an industrial power. So when Stalin and the Bolshevik took responsibility for leading the USSR in the mid-1920s, Russia was an economically backward, largely peasant country that was devastated by World War I, Civil War, famine, and even foreign interventions. In 1920, Russia's industrial output had fallen to roughly 20% compared to its 1913 level. Like steel, coal, and oil productions were shattered. Transportation was in ruins, the cities were depopulated by hunger and chaos. However, under Stalin's leadership, the Soviet Union embarked on a planned socialist industrialization through the first, second, and third year plans that was begun in 1928. And according to Soviet and Western economic historians, by the late 1930s, coal output increased from more about 35 million tons in 1927 to 1928 to over 130 million tons in 1937. Like steel production grew from roughly 4 million tons to more than 17 to 18 million tons in the same period. Overall, the industrial output multiplied several times. The USSR became the second largest industrial power in the world, behind only the United States. These were not abstract numbers. They meant electricity in villages, railways, and factories where none had existed, tractors instead of wooden plows, schools and hospitals where it had been a Tsarist neglect. And talking about life expectancy in Tsarist Russia before the revolution, it was only about 32 years. But that ended and dramatically changed when Lenin and Stalin and also the Bolsheviks took place. It grew dramatically to over 60 years in the post-war decades. It is due to mass illiteracy was abolished, millions of workers, peasants, and children entered universities and technical institutes. That is what we mean when we say that Stalin's line on socialist construction was fundamentally correct. And under conditions of encirclement and imminent war, we all know that there is no peaceful and gradual road from feudal backwardness to socialism. Either the USSR industrialized at breakneck speed or it would be crushed. Stalin expressed this bluntly in 1931. He said that we are 50 to 100 years behind advanced countries. We must make good this lag in 10 years. Either we do it or they crush us. That statement was not paranoia, and then 10 years later, in 1941, Nazi Germany invaded. Second, collectivization, famine, and class struggle in the countryside. Critics often reduce Stalin's entire legacy to the horrors of collectivization and the famines in the early 1930s, especially in Ukraine on what they call Holodomor. But we, as Marxist-Leninists, we do analysis in this way. We do not deny the suffering nor the existence of coercion or even grave mistakes, but we insist on an understanding why the leadership moved in that way, in that direction, and what the alternatives were. Because first, when we see the USSR faced a fundamental contradiction, a socialist state resting on the working class department, and of course, these kulaks, or what we call rich peasants, who control grain, land, and rural credit. Second, during the late 1920s, the grain procurement crisis threatened the supply of food to the cities and also to the Red Army. And lastly, if privatization, a capitalist path, restoring the trade and allowing a new agrarian bourgeoisie that would be implemented, this could be an effective alternative, but it would have meant abandoning socialism itself. Because what's the reason if you revolted against an exploitative Tsarist rule and then you will restore it back? So what's the purpose of revolution on that? So no, we will continue on the path of socialism. So we will continue on this path of collectivization because we have no choice. And collectivization create large mechanized collective farms like kolkhozes and state farms like sovkhozes. It was a harsh and often violent attempt to resolve this contradiction in favor of the working class. Collectivization that involves expropriation and the kulakization of rich peasants as a class, merging millions of individual plots into a large farms that could have been mechanized and bringing agricultural underplanned procurement to feed the cities and supply industries. Were there brutalities, abuses, and bureaucratic distortions? Yes. Were there famines, especially in 1932 to 1933 in Ukraine, Kazakhstan, and other regions? Yes. Many serious historians estimate the total excess of deaths in those years in the range of 3 to 5 million people due to crop failure, chaotic implementation, peasant resistance, and rigid grain procurement. Now, from a Marxist-Leninist perspective, these are real tragedies that must be studied critically, not erased. But we reject the bourgeois myth that this was a deliberate genocide of Ukrainians or a senseless act of sadism. There is no serious archival evidence that Stalin set out to exterminate a nationality, exterminate Ukraine, Kazakhstan, or these ones. Famine is resulted from the collision of objective scarcity, rushed policy, class struggle in the countryside, and a bureaucratic apparatus often blind and harsh in its method. We also insist on the historical outcome that by the late 1930s, and especially in the World War II, Soviet agriculture, though still troubled, was largely mechanized. Millions of peasants had become literate, collective farmers with access to schools, clinics, and social services that is unknown under the Tsar regime. And then, the USSR could feed a rapidly growing urban working class and sustain a modern army. This transformation, achieved in 2 decades, not centuries, was a precondition for surviving fascism. Third, the Great Purge and problems of repression. Another central charge to Stalin is that Stalin was a bloodthirsty tyrant who randomly murdered millions of communists during the Great Purge of 1937 to 1938. We, Marxist-Leninists, do not glorify purges. We know they involved terrible injustices, false accusations, and executions of many loyal revolutionaries. At the same time, we note a few key points. Even the conservative archival researches, such as that analyzed by J.R.K. Getty and others, shows that the total number of people executed for political and criminal offenses in the peak of purge years in 1937 to 1938 was on the order of 600,000 to 700,000, not mythical tens of millions. The broader Gulag population in the late 1930s was in the low millions, comparable in scale, though not identical in nature, that is due to mass incarceration under late capitalism today. The USSR at that time was facing real internal and external threats, remnants of old ruling classes, sabotage, espionage, and rising danger of fascist war. Some conspiracies were real. Others were invented or exaggerated by overzealous officials. Now, from a Marxist-Leninist perspective, the lesson is double. First is that worker state must defend itself in the means of repression and counter-revolution. Second is that such repression under strict proletarian control, bound by revolutionary legality, and subject to criticism and correction. Otherwise, it degenerates into bureaucratic terror that harms the revolution itself. We all know Stalin's era from these lessons that we have learned today combined both aspects, necessary firmness and serious excesses. So, when we say Stalin did nothing wrong, we are not denying the wrongful arrests, the executions of innocents, or the tragedies of the Gulag. We are saying that the overall historical assessment cannot be reduced to these episodes and the defense of the first socialist state in a hostile capitalist world that was not a crime but an avoidable historical necessity. For short, these events that was faced of Stalin in his conditions of leading the USSR in these days, that's why he did these purges, repression, and so on, is because Stalin had no choice. And these actions was inevitable in order to protect and preserve the sovereignty of the Soviet Union. Fourth and the last is the decisive role in defeating fascism. Perhaps the most decisive test of Stalin's leadership was in World War II, or what we call it today as the Great Patriotic War. Here, the record is clear. In June 1941, Nazi Germany, backed by the Europe's much industrial and military might, they launched Operation Barbarossa, the largest invasion in human history. The goal, stated openly by Hitler and his generals, was to destruct the Soviet state, the enslavement or extermination of Slavic peoples, and the crushing of communist movements worldwide. Now, despite the initial catastrophic losses, the Soviet Union, under the political and military leadership of Comrade Stalin and the Communist Party, they managed to do this. First is to evacuate and relocate thousands of factories eastward, beyond the reach of the Wehrmacht. Second is mobilize tens of millions of people, intellectuals, workers, and peasants into a unified war effort. And third is to turn the tide at battles like Stalingrad, like what happened in 1942 to 1943 and Kursk in 1943, where the Red Army destroyed the core of the Nazi war machine. The cost was immense. Estimated 26 to 27 million Soviet citizens died in war, including soldiers and civilians. But by May 1945, the Red Army had raised the red flag over Berlin. It is a plain historical fact that without the USSR and its enormous sacrifices, the fascist powers would likely have triumphed, or at very least prolonged their rule over Europe and even beyond. Even non-communist historians acknowledges that the Soviet Union bore the brunt of the war against Nazi Germany. Around 80% of German military losses occurred on the Eastern Front. Of course, that was launched by the Red Army and led by the Soviet Union itself. So you see, this worker state that Stalin helped to industrials, and its arm was the shield behind him, which the rest of the world would have been survived. Now, this is the question. Is this of our phrase that Stalin did nothing wrong, the destruction of Hitlerism and fascism, and saving of the countless peoples from racial extermination, not a central part of Stalin's legacy? Think again. So let us return first to the phrase. When we, Marxist-Leninists, say that Stalin did nothing wrong, we don't mean that Stalin literally did nothing wrong. Just like what I said earlier, we mean that his historical role in building the first socialist state, industrializing a backward country, defeating fascism, and defending and developing Marxism-Leninism that was later passed on to Enver Hoxha to defeat revisionism. This cannot be reduced to bourgeois caricatures of a paranoid monster. We mean that his strategic choices, such as rapid industrialization, collectivization, building a planned economy, maintaining a one-party proletarian dictatorship that is under siege, were broadly correct and historically necessary, even if some tactics were harsh or mishandled, because we all know these things under socialism is inevitable. We need to develop a society without these reactionary elements and, of course, the threats that is harming the sovereignty of the state. And, of course, the alternative paths that proposed by his opponent, like Bukharin's slowdown, Trotsky's permanent opposition, and later became Khrushchev's revisionism, would have likely led to capitalist restoration much earlier, or to destruction of the USSR before it could withstand fascism. So that many crimes attributed to Stalin are widely exaggerated, decontextualized, or fabricated or even politicized by Cold War propaganda, while his genuine achievements, victory over Nazi Germany, eradication of illiteracy, mass social mobility for workers and peasants, are ignored or even minimized. How great is that, bro? So you see that this this imperialism is really a threat to our world today. The West wants to rule us. Remove our original identity and change it to them. Expansionism. That's what the West wants, and that's what we socialists fight on, for our country's true independence and its sovereignty. And lastly, to say Stalin did nothing wrong is therefore a political slogan, a polemic way of rejecting capitalists' moralizing that judges a besieged worker state by standards that it never applies to its own colonial massacres, genocides, and imperialist wars. It is a refusal to put Stalin on the same level as Hitler, as liberal historiography likes to do. Liberals likes to do this, that the political compass, fascism and communism are the two sides of political spectrum, horseshoe theory and this one and this and so on, that they compare Stalin to Hitler. You're saying that they are all the same, they are all dictators. You are stupid. You guys are stupid. Do not ever say that in front of our face, because we will get out of dialogue, really. So, as Marxist-Leninists, we are not in the business of canonizing saints or patronizing them. We study Stalin's time dialectically. We learn from his successes and from his errors. We defend what must be defended, and we criticize what must be criticized. So, comrades, Stalin has been dead for decades. The USSR itself has collapsed, not because it was too Stalinist, but because revisionism, internal threats, and capitalist restoration hollowed it from within. Yet the struggle between the capital and labor continues in every country today. Now, to commemorate Stalin's birthday by saying Stalin did nothing wrong is to affirm that the working class has nothing to apologize for in building and defending the first socialist state. We reject the guilt that the ruling class wants to impose or any attempt to overthrow it, and that we stand with those who are like Stalin and the Soviet people that dared to challenge imperialism not only in words but in action and also in power. So our task today is not to repeat 1930s, but to understand them scientifically, to extract lessons needed for future revolutions, disciplined parties, socialist planning, proletarian internationalism, and unwavering struggle against fascism and revisionism, and of course, internal conflicts. So, with that, honor to the Soviet workers and peasants, honor to the Red Army that crushed fascism, and on this anniversary, it might be critical, but I will give a firm respect to comrade under whose leadership that victory was made possible, and that is Comrade Joseph Vissarionovich Stalin.